All right, so we're back and ready for our next speaker. We are just really honored to have Tara Hess joining us from the Open Sanctuary Project. Tara has spent close to a decade working as a caregiver and in shelter management at Farm Sanctuary. She's now working with the Open Sanctuary Project, and she is their senior advisor. She uses her hands-on experience to help create animal care resources that are accessible and reflect the many nuances of sanctuary work and caregiving. Despite having a desk job now, she continues to be a chicken caregiver, sharing her home with an amazing rooster named Cantaloupe. And we're so happy to have you, Tara. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you so much. I am not tech savvy. So I just share my screen. I have a presentation to share. Okay.
Yeah, the little green button, share screen.
Fingers crossed.
Sometimes there's
oh yeah, I think
several
this is
icons
it.
come up and oh good, looks like you got it.
Okay, do I though? Hopefully. Oh gosh, this is like my nightmare. Just like trying to navigate technology. Okay, I think I'm finally ready.
Awesome.
Hopefully, right. Let me just move this. What is this thing? Sorry, I've just got like a little guy in my way. Okay.
You don't see it.
All right. Sorry for all that. So I want to start by just giving a little bit more background about who I am and why I'm here talking about this topic. So I started out as a caregiver in 2008, and it was a real challenge to find information about the compassionate care of farmed animals. I was working at Farm Sanctuary, which cares for, multiple species of farmed animals. And like most brand new caregivers, I was super enthusiastic. And I remember just wanting to learn as much as I possibly could, but not really knowing like where to go with that or how to make that happen. And so I remember asking my boss for book recommendations. Now, again, this is 2008, and I was working and living in a rural area. So like an internet research was not accessible. We had like dial-up internet that wasn't reliable. I needed books I could get my hands on. So I asked my boss for book recommendations. And I remember her explaining to me that the information that was available out there about farmed animal care like didn't really apply to what we were doing. And so instead of, trying to find these sources of information, she suggested that I just learn by doing the job. And I did. I learned by doing the job. I learned by working with caregivers who had more experience than I did. I learned by watching my boss, who would teach folks who came out to Farm Sanctuary for training. I learned by listening intently to the avian vet who made regular visits to the sanctuary. And then more times than I care to admit, I learned by messing up. And so, sometimes this was because, I was distracted by all the things that I needed to do. And maybe I was like moving too quickly, sort of like the time that I failed to properly secure the lid to a can of food in an area with Cornishes, and folks who care for Cornishes probably know where this story is going. I came back to find a super full and super uncomfortable Cornish hen waiting for me because of this mistake that I had made. Other times my mistakes were just because I was inexperienced. Like I was learning as I was going. I remember a month or two after I was hired, my boss called me out to one of the chicken barns to point out a mounting wound, which I didn't even know mounting wounds were a thing, but she points out a mounting wound that I had clearly missed earlier in the day. And so I've made lots of mistakes that I regret, but some of the mistakes that I made that I most regret actually weren't this specific action of like doing or not doing something right. It was that I wasn't thinking critically about all this information I was trying to take in to learn all I could about the care of farmed animals. So unlike mistakes like the ones I mentioned, unlike other types of mistakes where there was this almost immediate learning opportunity, and then a sincere effort on my part to do better going forward. So you better believe I was super careful with food can lids, And I was always looking for signs that someone might be overmounted, when my main mistake was that I was relying on flawed information, but I didn't realize it. There wasn't that immediate or timely learning opportunity. Sometimes it took weeks, months, or even years before I realized that this information that I was relying on was flawed in some way. And so what that means is that instead of making an immediate correction, like I tried to do with other types of mistakes, I just kept doing the same thing over and over again. And not only that, sometimes I was sharing that information that I had received and I sort of took to be the thing, and I would share it with others, which of course is then just exacerbating the situation. So I share this because I am certainly not some sort of expert who always gets it right. I know from experience how hard it can be to find good information. And I also know that sometimes it can be hard to discern the good from the bad. In my current role at the Open Sanctuary Project, I have the privilege of creating the resources that I wanted when I was starting out as a caregiver. And so that means that I am pretty regularly navigating chicken care sources. I say care, but often it's keeping. But I'm navigating the information that's out there about chickens, and I'm evaluating different pieces of information. So I'm like sort of like familiar with the stuff that's out there. For folks who aren't maybe familiar with the Open Sanctuary Project, I just want to quickly talk about what we do. We're a free online resource for people who care for farmed animals as companions rather than commodities. And so sometimes that means we're covering topics that just aren't really talked about outside of the sanctuary community. So something like the care of Cornish crosses as companions. And other times it means we're talking about topics that are covered elsewhere outside of the sanctuary community, but we're doing so from a non-exploitative perspective and really focused on the topic as it applies to sanctuaries. So to create the resources that we create and to make sense of all the information that's out there, we've had to create a system for making sense of it all, basically. And I'll admit that it is an imperfect and evolving system. So as a team, we're regularly trying to figure out how we can do things better at the Open Sanctuary Project. And sometimes that means rethinking the way we do our sourcing. And actually preparing for this presentation sparked another conversation with the OSP team about how we do just that. Now, the challenge is it's easy to say, and I wish I could say, we're going to use sources that only meet like these criteria. But depending on the topic that we're covering, strictly adhering to what might seem like totally reasonable criteria could actually disqualify like every source that we come across. So to some degree, we're sort of left to do the best we can with a very like imperfect situation that we're in. So the moral of all this is that, finding high quality information about the compassionate care of chickens is an uphill battle for sure. But if we think critically about the sources that we come across and the information that they share, we can really reduce our chances that we are inadvertently relying on the wrong information. So why is it so hard to find good information in the first place? There are lots of different reasons, and actually some of them have been covered throughout the other presentations. We have societal views, we have the widespread influence of animal agriculture, we have the fact that anyone can be a quote unquote expert, and I'm gonna explain this little graphic that I made in a second. And in some cases, the information we're looking for just doesn't exist. So unfortunately, we are living in a society that views, for the most part, chickens as commodities versus sentient beings worthy of care. To make matters worse, according to the Food Animal Residue Avoidance and Depletion website, the FDA considers all chickens to be food animals, regardless of an owner's attachment to a particular bird. Accordingly, all regulations pertaining to the treatment of food animals, including the use of prohibited substances, should be followed when treating backyard chickens. So this food animal label, besides being, totally offensive and infuriating, seriously limits the drugs that are available to legally treat chickens. And so what this means is that even when, and not just chickens, but I'm focusing on chickens. So that means that even when chickens have been freed from these exploitative settings, they are still being harmed by animal agriculture. Now, some veterinarians will prescribe drugs that are technically prohibited, but in general, this food animal label poses a serious challenge to chicken caregivers, and it also affects the types of information that are out there in terms of treatments. Similarly, a lot of the information that is out there about chickens, especially scientific information, is tied to animal agriculture, where the focus is going to be performance, productivity, and profits. This is a list of past workshops that were sponsored by the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. And the emphasis, I added the emphasis. So we have feed conversion, effect on performance, improved productivity, cost of production, economically significant diseases. Clearly the running theme here is economics. And if that is the focus of this information that's being put out by some vets, like obviously that's going to affect the information that is being provided. So finding, information about chicken health that's not tied to commodification can be really challenging. So now back to this shady little graphic that I made, especially when it comes to online sources. The reality is, like, anyone can post almost anything. And first of all, it's not always clear like where or who it's even coming from. But the bar for calling oneself an expert when it comes to chicken care, which I keep using, but some people aren't even claiming to provide chicken care, they're keeping chickens. But the bar for calling oneself an expert on chickens is super, super, super low. And then on top of this, if you have the right like marketing and design, you can really make yourself look legit and like you really are this expert you're claiming to be. So I wanted to just share an example that I think really illustrates this point well. There is this company that sells access to chicken keeping courses that they value themselves at being worth over $2,000. On their about page, they say, affectionately known as experts, we use our expertise in poultry rearing to develop educational content for aspiring chicken keepers. Our resources are nothing to cluck at. Every ounce of information is insightful, verified, and delivered according to the student's learning level. Now, I want to just share that this company with these experts have a social media account that I checked out because I like to just do some snooping. And they posted this picture of a chicken who was clearly male, so clearly a rooster. And they had the caption on there, help us name her, like all cutesy. And so like I do, for people who do know chickens, I do want to acknowledge that sometimes in photos, particularly if the chickens are young, it can be hard to tell if you're looking at a hen or a rooster, but like that was not the case here, not even a little bit. This rooster was just screaming male. And I didn't use the actual photo because I didn't have permission to use it and I didn't want to cause any trouble for OSP. So I just made, a little reenactment, which I feel is actually pretty spot on to what they had going on. But yeah, like the people posting on the social media account might not be the so-called experts, like maybe it's just like some social media expert. But I just felt like this combination of these folks being self-proclaimed experts, which of course in and of itself is super telling, and then also posting a photo of a rooster and acting as though he were a hen just sort of summed up the current state of things when it comes to the types of information you might come across online in terms of chicken care. Like it is just like a free-for-all of you could find anything. And then again, I already mentioned this, but in some cases it's hard to find good information because the information itself just might not exist. So because chickens are only allowed to live for a fraction of their natural lifespan in animal agriculture settings, And because so much of the information that's out there is tied to productivity and profits, there are certain topics that are super important to sanctuary care that just are completely ignored and aren't covered in the information that's available for the most part. And those are topics like the care of Cornish crosses, elder care, the care of chickens with disabilities, things like that. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be tossing around like good, bad a bit. And I do want to acknowledge that, you know, that's a simplistic take on what's probably a bit more complex situation. But when I'm saying like, I want good information or I'm looking for good information, I mean information that is accurate, current, complete, based on a clear understanding of who chickens are and what they need, and is focused on the well-being of the individual, as opposed to being incorrect, outdated, overtly harmful, based on commodification, speciesism, exploitation, or provided without context, oversimplified, or too generalized. Now, of course, there are going to be different degrees of bad, and there might also be some information that is valuable, but like can't tick all the boxes on the good side. So we'll talk about specific types of sources later on, but one thing that comes to mind is veterinary information. So you might find information that's accurate, current, complete, and is based on a clear understanding of who chickens are in terms of their anatomy and their physiology, but it might totally ignore what they need as sentient beings, and it might be steeped in commodification, speciesism, and exploitation. So that doesn't mean that like we throw out all veterinary information. It means that we just have to think about it through the lens of like understanding where it's coming from and really adding to it or looking at it through the lens of like who chickens are and what it means to provide sanctuary to figure out how to make it work in a sanctuary space. So with that in mind, I thought it would be helpful to start by thinking about who chickens are and what they need. I think if you create sort of a list of absolutes, it can help guide the process of evaluating sources and information. Now, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. I think really you could probably put on a 45-minute presentation just about these absolutes of like who chickens are. But I think that the next few slides that I have are a good foundation and hit on points that are often misrepresented in the world of chicken information. So I'm just going to run through these. And I'm sure some of these, you know, folks already are well aware of. Chickens are individuals with inherent value. Their worth is not tied to a monetary amount, what we can get from them, or how they interact with us. Chickens are descended from forest-dwelling red junglefowl, as Alistair already talked about. This notion of them belonging in wide open pasture-like spaces comes directly from farming. Chickens are domesticated birds whose bodies have been manipulated through generations of selective breeding practices. The number of eggs hens lay is not natural, nor is the body type or appetite of large breed chickens. Chickens are prey animals. Regardless of where you live, predator protection is an important part of caregiving. Chickens should be fed a diet that's based on what they need, not what scraps are lying around. Chickens need protection from the elements year-round, regardless of their breed. Chickens are social animals. They should not be forced to live in total isolation. Now, chickens are also unique individuals and will have their own needs and preferences when it comes to social arrangements, which might not always look like a traditional flock, but that's different than these practices of just forcing them to live in total isolation with no companionship whatsoever. More absolutes. Chickens feel pain. Like us, they benefit from pain management for painful conditions and need proper analgesics and anesthetic when undergoing surgical procedures. Roosters are chickens too. They are not inherently aggressive to other roosters, hens, or humans, which I know has already been covered. Chickens deserve the same consideration as other companion animals when they near the end of their life. If euthanasia is deemed the most compassionate choice given the individual's quality of life, it should be performed with the same gentle, non-physical methods most folks expect for their beloved cat or dog. So if we consider these absolutes and you are doing research about predator proofing and you come across this, which is a real recommendation I found. As far as tucking them in at night, you don't have to if you keep your chickens completely free range. Consider them a wild critter on your property that gives you deliciously fresh eggs every day. Finally, I don't know about you, but I just think that free range eggs taste so much better. Do you agree? Of course I don't. But we can very quickly reject this recommendation, and we'll probably also be side-eyeing the source it came from because of the multiple ways that just this little part goes against those absolutes that I just went over. So now let's talk about evaluating sources. You want to evaluate sources because this is going to help you figure out if something's even worth your time to look at. So I think it's helpful to ask questions like, who's behind this source? What's their experience with chickens? Are they well suited to speak about the subject at hand? How do they view chickens? How might this affect the information they share and what they recommend? So to figure out how they view chickens, I'd pay attention to how they're either talking or writing about chickens. Are they referring to them as it, or are you seeing he, she, and they? Does it seem like they are a nameless flock or a group of unique individuals? Are they only talking about hens? This is super, super common and shows a direct link to those exploitative settings where chickens are exploited for their eggs and therefore males are useless and, as Alistair mentioned, are discarded or killed. So you want to pay attention to that and also focus on or pay attention to what they are focusing on. Sometimes it'll be sort of misleading because you'll see sources use the word well-being, but when you actually pay attention to what they're talking about, they're solely talking about the chicken's well-being as it affects productivity, not their well-being for the sake of being comfortable and happy and having a good quality of life. You also want to pay attention to who their intended audience is because this can affect the information that they're sharing. Obviously, something the Open Sanctuary Project puts out, which is intended for compassionate caregivers, is going to have some different stuff going on than something that is intended for farmers or something that is intended for veterinarians. And then can you tell where the source is getting their information? Sometimes it's clear that they're passing on information that came from somewhere else, but they don't share any sources. So you just have no idea where the information is coming from. And then just because you decide that a particular source is good and generally reliable doesn't mean that every single recommendation that they share is going to be good or appropriate in a sanctuary setting. So you also want to evaluate the actual recommendation. So ask questions like, whose needs are at the forefront, the chickens or the humans? Is this coming from a source qualified to make recommendations on the subject? Does it harm chickens directly or indirectly? Does it fit with our absolutes that I talked about? And then what's the ultimate goal of this recommendation? What risks, if any, come with following this recommendation? Are there other ways to achieve a similar outcome, but with fewer or no risks? And then can I find trusted sources that support this recommendation? I have an informal rule of 3 where I like to find 2 additional sources that can back up a recommendation in another source, but depending on the topic, that can be challenging. And I've also found that it's not super uncommon online to find sources just sort of plagiarizing each other or regurgitating the same information. So I try to look at that, does it seem like this is information that, someone's just sharing from another source, or does it seem like it's, verified and sort of vetted and then shared? Because that to me is different. And then it's possible that you would go through all of these questions and maybe still be a little bit unsure about a particular recommendation. And so in general, I think it's a good idea to adhere to the precautionary principle. If something has the potential of causing irreversible harm, you probably want to err on the side of not taking that recommendation. But one exception that comes to mind is veterinary interventions, particularly surgical interventions, which could carry significant risk, but you would want to weigh those risks against the risks of not taking the, not having the surgical intervention done by a licensed veterinarian, because, that's really a more complicated evaluation process of weighing risks. Okay, so now we'll look at some common sources for chicken information. And these aren't the only sources that a caregiver would come across, but these will be our focus today. We'll talk about what types of information these sources can provide, what challenges might come up when using these sources, and then also some suggestions for navigating those sources. So before we talk about veterinary sources generally, let's consider how your own vet plays a role in, sharing information and being a source of information. Now, if you care for chickens, you absolutely have to have a relationship with a vet who is willing and able to treat chicken patients. If you're interested in learning more about the importance of veterinary care, Open Sanctuary Project has a resource on the subject. And at the end of this presentation, I'll link to all the resources that I mentioned. We also have basic chicken care courses that cover this topic in more depth as well. So board certified avian veterinarians are going to have an advanced level of education in avian medicine and surgery. But the reality is that not everyone is going to have a board certified avian vet in their area. And so the key is to find a vet who is experienced with chickens, or at the very least willing to learn and can provide individualized care to your residents. So in addition to, performing exams and running diagnostics and prescribing treatments as needed, there are other types of information that they could be a good source of. So these are things like information about specific conditions that your residents have or are at risk of developing, information about disease prevention, hands-on training for certain things like how to administer medications or provide supportive care, manage an open wound, maybe nutritional recommendations, and also general healthcare protocols. So maybe like recommendations about parasite screening, or right now, enhanced biosecurity measures to protect against HPAI. So what challenges might come up when working with your veterinarian or getting information from them? Now, the challenges that come up are going to depend a lot on the vet. It's going to depend on their philosophy in terms of, like who chickens are and what they need, their experience with chickens, and it can also really be influenced by your own relationship with them. But some general challenges that tend to come up are they might not know a lot or anything about elder care or the care of Cornish crosses. They may not have any experience with disabled birds, and they may actually feel really strongly that birds with disabilities can never have a decent quality of life and that they should be euthanized. Like that might be a very strong recommendation that they make. They may not be used to working with clients who are willing to spend money on diagnostics and treatments. And so sometimes this manifests as them not recommending or mentioning all of the available options. And now I think for some vets, this may be their own biases that they don't think chickens are worth, certain interventions that are expensive or involved. But I think other times it's just a matter of habit. If all of their clients, for the most part, would never consider certain options, they just might not recommend or even mention them anymore. Then some other challenges. They might be used to treating chickens as a flock rather than individuals, and it's really that individualized care that you want. They may make recommendations that don't mesh with sanctuary care or are absolutes. And depending on the vet, they may even recommend some backyard chicken keeping recommendations. There's also the fact that vets are humans. And so even the best vet, the most experienced vet, could sometimes get it wrong. And I already mentioned the food animal label, but there is the impact of that and the restrictions that it places on veterinarians, some of whom might really strictly adhere to only prescribing medications that are labeled for chickens. And then this one is another one that is going to depend on the vet, but the way they perform euthanasia usually may be in conflict with our absolutes. There are numerous methods of euthanasia that are approved by the American Medical Veterinary Association, the AVMA, that are not gentle or non-physical and are like in no way what someone would typically expect for a companion animal. So how can we navigate these challenges? I'd recommend by starting on like working on building your relationship with your vet. So make sure that they understand your philosophy and what you generally expect for your residents. This isn't, it's not a chicken example, but I feel like it's sort of helpful. When I was working at Farm Sanctuary, there were mobile large animal vets who would come out regularly, and they had been working with Farm Sanctuary for years. So they knew exactly what the caregiving team expected and wanted for their residents. And sometimes they would bring vet students with them. So these are large animal vets, and there's like a certain large animal vet mentality that is very different from what like a sanctuary would want for their residents. And so one of the mobile large animal vets explained to me that when she would bring vet students out, she would spend the car ride over working on getting them in companion animal mode, which is a different mode than large animal vet. So that's sort of what I mean by this, like work on building your relationship and make sure that they understand what you want. Like if they aren't in that companion animal mode, try to work on getting them there and making sure that they understand that that's what you want. To avoid issues with euthanasia, I would recommend creating a euthanasia policy and sharing it with your vet well before you're ever in a situation where you might need to consider euthanasia for a resident. We do have a template that folks can use to get started. By broaching this topic before you need to actually have a conversation about a specific individual, you'll be able to ensure that your vet is both willing and able to perform euthanasia in the way that you expect. And if they can't, then you can find someone who can. I'd also recommend just generally being in the habit of always following up with like, are these the only options, or what other options are available, or maybe trying to figure out specific options to ask about. And then depending on the topic, it can be really helpful to use information that's coming from your vet in conjunction with information that's coming from sanctuary sources. So this is especially helpful when you're caring for individuals that your vet might not have much experience with, which in some cases might be chickens generally, but oftentimes are particular individuals like Cornish crosses or birds with certain disabilities or elderly chickens. So if you can connect with sanctuaries who are really experienced with those individuals, that can be really helpful and they can sometimes help you make sense of the information that your vet is sharing, or they can give you information that you might then bring to your vet. And then if you can, if you don't agree with a diagnosis or recommendation from your vet, you could try to get a second opinion. I'll admit that this is sometimes easier said than done, because sometimes just finding one vet in your area who can see chickens, like that might be a challenge in and of itself. And so finding a second vet can be a challenge. But something that can be helpful is, again, if you have connected with these other caregivers who do have experience with these things, you might see if they have a good relationship with their vet and they trust their vet, maybe their vet could be a resource for your veterinarian. In my experience, vets don't love talking or consulting with like a non-professional. So even if you have a sanctuary operator who is just like amazing and super knowledgeable, asking your vet to talk to that person who's not a vet might not be well received, but asking your vet if they'll consult with another vet that maybe has experience with certain things that they don't, like might be might be more seriously considered. So then there's other veterinary sources that you might use. These are things like textbooks, veterinary websites, journals, and they can be a helpful use of source of information on things like diseases, drug information about anatomy and physiology, about nutrition, diagnostic interpretation, and sometimes they even provide instructions for performing certain care tasks. But there are, of course, challenges that can come with some of these sources. So if they're centered around chickens or other farmed bird species, again, like I mentioned earlier, the focus is often going to be on economic impact and productivity and not the chicken's well-being. And so this is going to have an effect on the information that they're sharing and can especially impact things like the prognosis that they talk about for certain diseases. And also if they are providing instructions for performing certain tasks, like things like handling and restraint. If the focus is economics and not the chicken's well-being, like I would rather rely on a sanctuary than like a vet textbook in terms of like how one should hold a chicken. Again, if the focus is chickens and other farmed birds, there might not be anything in the way of treatment options that is actually like mentioned when they're talking about certain diseases. Sometimes this is due to that food animal designation that I keep mentioning. And other times it's just because in animal agriculture settings, treatment usually isn't considered either due to cost or feasibility. There are also certain populations that are going to be completely ignored in these types of sources, again, because of that connection to animal agriculture, where chickens are only allowed to live for a fraction of their lifespan. So if you're reading about a certain disease, it's going to talk about how that disease impacts chickens who are that age range that they're being kept in these settings. It's not going to talk about how these diseases or conditions affect elderly or even middle-aged individuals. And then depending on the source, if you're reading about something like diseases, the information might be outdated. There might be stuff that has come up since it was published that is either like more information or sometimes even different information. They may have figured out that something they thought in the past is no longer true. So how do we navigate these challenges? First, I just want to stress that veterinary textbooks and websites and stuff, like they're great and they can be helpful, but they're not meant to be a replacement for proper veterinary care or a relationship with your veterinarian. So I would say that like to avoid some of these challenges or navigate them, I would use information from these sources in conjunction with consulting with your veterinarian. So like something that comes to mind is if your vet suspects or has confirmed that one of your residents has a particular condition that maybe you're not super familiar with, you might look to these sources to learn more about like what causes this disease, like how does it spread, all these sorts of things. And then you can bring that information to your vet to help sort of make sense of it all or help apply it to the specific individual in your care. I already mentioned this, but I'd also consult with sanctuary sources with applicable experience. Sorry, I never speak for this long and I'm like losing my ability. So again, things like handling, restraint, like I would want to talk to a sanctuary, someone who is like focused on the well-being of these individuals to figure out what the best way is to do these things rather than relying on a source that's geared towards an animal ag setting. Trusted sanctuary sources can also sometimes give you a better idea of prognosis, because sometimes in these sources and maybe even talking to your own vet, like there just might not be much that's actually known about the prognosis of certain conditions when individuals are given proper care, and again, that individualized care. So even if it sounds pretty grim from your vet or from like veterinary textbooks, consulting with someone who actually has experience caring for these individuals could give you a better idea of the prognosis. And then to avoid outdated information, I just recommend that folks be really careful paying attention to when things were published. You know, if you're using a textbook, pay attention to what edition you're using, when it was published, are there newer editions available? And when you're using stuff online, you know, check to see the date that it was published. I meant to mention this and I failed to mention it, so I want to do it now, but I'd also recommend that you make sure it's actually a vet source, because there are some things that sort of, you know, whether it be a book or a website, they sort of look like they're a veterinary source, but they aren't actually written by veterinarians. So I'd pay attention to that. And then the last thing is, if you're having trouble finding information about treatment, which is pretty common, I already mentioned that, it can sometimes be helpful to broaden your search to include other species of birds. It's usually helpful to include parrots, because while not every condition that affects chickens affects different species of parrots, there is some crossover, and you might find more in the way of treatment. And then again, that's going to be information you can bring to your veterinarian, and they can help you figure out if the information can be applied. Is this my 10-minute warning?
Hey, Tara, 5 minutes. I know you wanted a 10-minute, I forgot. So 5 minutes. And you know what, since this is the last, you're the last presentation, we can give you about 5 or 10 to wrap up, because I think you have a lot more, don't you?
I mean, I think I probably have 10 minutes left. I was sort of proud of myself. Okay, I'll try to go fast.
Don't worry about it. Take your time, because you're the last. So
okay.
10 more minutes would be great.
Okay. So another source of information that caregivers might come across or will commonly come across are sanctuary sources. And these can be a great source of information and can give you info on things like proper housing, diet, group dynamics, enrichment, how to perform certain tasks, information about diseases, and then care recommendations, especially if they have like a certain population that they focus on. Now, there are some challenges that can come with navigating sanctuary sources, and I hope that nothing I say sounds like I'm against sanctuaries sharing information with each other, because I'm absolutely not. I think it's a very important thing that happens within the community, but I do think there are some issues that can sometimes come up. So the first is that it's not always clear where information is coming from. And when the information isn't anecdotal and someone's just passing along information from another source, there can sometimes be that game of telephone where things get sort of like, you know, misconstrued as they go along. There's also the fact that in some cases, some recommendations veer into the unauthorized practice of veterinary medicine. And the intent is good. Like, folks want to provide immediate care to individuals who are sick or injured. But I do want to stress that if you're not a licensed veterinarian, your job's not to be your chicken's vet. It's to be, you know, the person who's providing that daily care and the person who is advocating for them to get the veterinary care they need. You know, you shouldn't try to be their vet. There's also the possibility that a source could be sharing information that maybe they either misunderstood or came from a source that maybe doesn't meet all those criteria that we talked about earlier. And there's also the possibility that something could be taken out of context or shared without important details. And that can be especially problematic if the person receiving the information doesn't have a lot of experience. So to navigate these challenges, I just ask folks where they're getting their information from, and not in a like, you know, sort of like nasty way, but just like in a curious, like, hey, can I see this source? Like, I'd love to refer to it. That can be especially helpful if you're going to bring the information to your vet, because then again, instead of trying to relay information you got elsewhere, you can just be like, hey, look at this. What do you think? If someone has a really innovative way of doing something, I would bring that information to your vet to see if it's something that you can start doing. And in some cases, it might be helpful to have your vet connect with their vet. And then for information that's not coming from a vet and isn't widely covered elsewhere, I'd connect with other trusted sanctuary sources. So your vet might not have any idea what you should feed a Cornish hen, and a vet textbook probably isn't either, but you can connect with other vet sources or other sanctuary sources to sort of see like, what's the running theme here? Like, what do people have success with? Okay, so I do want to make sure I talk about chicken keeping sources. They cover a wide range of topics, all sorts of things. Sometimes diseases, including their own thoughts on prevention and treatment, and also instructions for performing certain care tasks, sometimes including procedures that should only be performed by a licensed veterinarian. So there are lots of challenges. We do have a resource called...
You sit there and wait, and I'll be back.
Sorry. We have a resource called Backyard Chicken Keeping Recommendations, a Word of Caution, that goes over this a bit more. So they're often focused on commodification, which of course is going to affect what they say chickens need. They're often prioritizing human convenience and desires over the needs of the individual. And that example I showed in the beginning about like, oh, just consider chickens wild critters on your property, I think really illustrates those 2 points. They're often focused on DIY treatments instead of proper veterinary care. So things like just diagnosing chickens yourself, just relying on like feed store antibiotics and apple cider vinegar water. And again, doing like these DIY treatments that have like no place in sanctuary settings or like any setting where you're caring for a living being. And on top of this, they sometimes spread misinformation about vet care. So saying things like, chickens don't need a vet, or vets don't know about chickens, so there's no point in bringing them to the vet, or vets won't even see chickens. And then another common one, which isn't exactly like misinformation, is this notion that vet care is too expensive, and therefore that's a justification for just like doing things yourself. And of course, that is stemming from this notion that the chickens have like a set value based on usually what you can get from them or what it costs to replace them, and that like they're not worth proper veterinary care. Depending on the source, you might have no idea like what they're actually qualified to talk about. And backyard chicken keeping forums are like especially a nightmare. So these are just some examples from that business that I mentioned that has those cheap chicken keeping courses. So ready to make, and I wrote chicken care courses. It should say chicken keeping. I just always put care and chickens together. Ready to make keeping chickens the easiest thing you've ever done. Find, diagnose, and treat any problem your chickens will ever have with step-by-step, on-demand, expert chicken keeping advice. And then later on, they say experts who within a matter of minutes will give you the exact answer to exactly what's happening with your chickens and what you need to do to get them back in good health with no expensive vet bills in sight. So I would just say, as a general rule, if a source is claiming to be a non-vet source, is claiming to be a substitute for veterinary care, like run and don't listen to them. And if somebody is claiming to be able to teach you to diagnose things on your own or to come out and diagnose things for you, but they're not a vet, like do not engage. So the bottom line, I'm almost done. I don't recommend backyard chicken keeping sources generally, especially not for folks who are just starting out, because it's just way too easy to be misled. If you think a particular backyard chicken keeping source is worth your time, I would strongly urge you to work with your veterinarian or a trusted caregiver to like verify the source. And then remember that if a recommendation sounds too good to be true because it offers a quick fix or an inexpensive alternative to proper vet care, it probably is. So, you know, caring for chickens in a society that views them as commodities to be used and consumed brings with it a lot of different challenges. But if we center what we know about chickens and who they are, we can thoughtfully evaluate the sources that we come across and the information that they share, and just like gather the useful bits, tweak the parts that need tweaking, and discard the rest. Thank you. Sorry for the rush at the end. Those are some sources that I mentioned that I wanted to share. And now I'll stop sharing my screen. Did I stop?
Oh, maybe keep the references up for a moment. Or
oh, okay.
If you can put them in the chat or something. I mean,
sorry, I was feeling so flustered that I was past time.
No, I'm sorry.
Now I don't know what I'm doing.
Didn't mean to rush you.
There they are. I can maybe put them in the chat if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so then I will stop sharing and I'll put them in the chat.
Okay.
Fantastic. Okay. Did I stop sharing?
Yep,
Yes.
you're good.
Okay.
Wait for Alistair to maybe stop the recording.
Okay, I'll stop.
I mean, yeah.